Hello, and welcome to Epidemics and the Evolution of Medicine. I'm Professor KAVEY, and I've created this video to give you access to all of the material that I compiled in putting this course together. You can watch the video, which will have the slides associated with it, or you can read the commentaries, which will be posted as PDFs on the course content site. Today we're going to begin by looking at the plague and its place in epidemics and the history of medicine. Our goal is to consider the way that medical care for specific conditions has evolved, and that will allow us to trace the historical trajectory of a disease and the way this disease relates to the history of medicine. So, an introduction. A brief historical survey tells us that as long as man has existed, individuals have become ill and others have tried to care for them. Our knowledge of medicine in prehistoric times is limited to archaeologic data, but exploration of ancient sites dating back to 8000 BC indicates the pervasive power of the spirit world and of supernatural forces in the understanding of people of that time. Ancient attempts to control phenomena that were beyond the reach of their understanding with existing pre-scientific knowledge tells us that worship of multiple gods, spirits, demons, deceased ancestors, and external agents of many kinds served as explanations for illness, births, deaths, and other natural occurrences. Prayer and rituals were created to appeal to these supernatural agents, and this was the major response to illness. Cave paintings and symbolic artifacts depict this spirit world, inhabited often by ancestors who had died, along with animals and the stars. Shaman, special individuals who were considered to be able to contact the spirit world, were called upon to heal the sick, and they are thought of as the first doctors. Excavated skulls from ancient burial sites dating back to this time period have been found with holes drilled into them. This is thought to be an attempt to allow evil spirits to escape. The technique is known as trepanning, and it's still used to evacuate subdural hematomas today. Shamans still play an important role in Native American and African cultures and in certain religions. In approximately 2000 BC, the Egyptians developed a sophisticated society which included care of the sick. Ancient Egyptians preserved the bodies of their dead royalty and buried many personal artifacts with them. These included written records on papyrus scrolls, and these writings reveal that the Egyptians had doctors who specialized in treating different parts of the body, including specialists for obstetrics. Their detailed records of the symptoms and treatments of illnesses form some of the first medical textbooks. And on this slide you can see this is from a papyrus scroll, a doctor evaluating the eye of a patient. Despite these signs of progress, religious beliefs dominated the ancient Egyptians' view of illness and recovery. The goddess Sekhmet was believed to cause or cure diseases and illness, was thought to be due to the presence of evil spirits. Removing these from the body with prayers to the gods was thought to be the cure for disease. Doctors were often priests who were thought to be able to communicate with the gods, responsible for the health of different parts of the body. They studied the properties of herbal medicines and prepared prescriptions of ointments and potions by processing plant materials to treat specific illnesses. Records showed that they used many preparations which included drugs we know today, and these were helped to reveal symptoms but were not thought to play any other role in the healing process, since disease was divine in origin and cure could only be divine, period. Around 400 BC, Greece developed a major advanced civilization in which writing, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine all flourished. At this time, most people still believed that diseases were sent as a punishment from the gods, and treatment focused on pleasing the gods so the disease would be cured. Into this society came the Greek philosopher Hippocrates, possibly the most famous name in medicine to this day. He gives the name to the Hippocratic Oath that all doctors take on graduation from medical school. On this slide you can see a bust of Hippocrates on the left and one of his textbooks from dating back to 400 BC on the right. His view of health and disease went against the conventional thinking to that time. He based medicine on objective observation and deductive reasoning. He described health as a balance between four humors: the blood, which represented energy, spirit, and liveliness; phlegm, which stood for lethargy and dullness; black bile, for depression or sadness; and yellow bile, anger or volatility. And these are shown on the next slide. Illness meant an imbalance in the humors, with treatment needed to return the balance to normal. The treatment often included bleeding or induced vomiting. This radical approach took medicine out of the spirit world, and the concept of the four humors formed the basis of medical treatment well into medieval times. Based on the work of Hippocrates, Greek physicians took detailed case histories to find out as much as possible from their patients about their symptoms, and then examined each patient carefully before combining the history and exam findings to make a considered diagnosis of the problem and recommend a course of treatment. Although Hippocrates' understanding of the pathophysiology of disease was incorrect, his method of history-taking and physical exam findings leading to diagnosis and treatment is still the basis of medical practice today. After the Romans conquered the Greeks, they brought their ideas about health and medicine into use across the Roman Empire. Galen was a Greek physician who was born in 130 BC. He emigrated to Rome and became the principal doctor for many of the professional gladiators and the personal physician for several emperors. At that time, it was illegal to dissect human bodies, and so he dissected animals to find out how their bodies worked. Galen's work substantially increased knowledge of anatomy and allowed Roman doctors to improve their technique in surgery. They developed new surgical instruments and gained further knowledge treating casualties in the many wars of conquest that the Romans fought. Military settlements had hospitals to treat soldiers, and army surgeons became proficient in treating acute battlefield trauma. Historical records that also show that they were able to treat bladder stones, hernias, and cataracts. As growing crops and managing livestock replaced hunting and gathering as the principal mode of survival, there was a shift in social structures. Large settlements became less egalitarian and more totalitarian, with the rise of chiefdoms, rulers, and other agents of social control. Priests and prophets became important members of the ruling class, and that marked a change in strategies of social control. Gradually, the multiple gods worship of ancient times was replaced by a monotheistic culture with worship of a single divine being. Obviously, in Western culture, this shift can be identified as centering around the birth of Christ. The Romans were the first to realize that there was a link between dirt and disease. To improve public health, they built aqueducts to supply clean drinking water and sewers to remove waste safely. This was centuries before these concepts emerged in European civilization. The Roman baths were designed to improve personal hygiene and thereby reduce disease. These concepts, actualized by the Romans in 200 to 300 AD, remain mainstays of public health to this day. We will study the importance of this kind of public health measure in particular when we explore the cholera epidemic. On the next slide, you can see a picture of the aqueduct on the left and one of the Roman baths, which has been rehabilitated and is now peopled by tourists. The fall of the Roman Empire meant that many of their public hygiene practices were lost. The Middle Ages in Europe saw most people without access to clean drinking water, regular bathing, or a sewage system. This meant that health conditions were often worse than during the Roman occupation centuries. Most people were farmers, growing crops or managing livestock, and starvation and disease were common. And here you can see on a tapestry a picture of life in the Middle Ages with farmers toiling on their knees with a supervisor looking on. Medicine in the Middle Ages was still dominated by religion. Sickness was believed to be a punishment from God for sins committed, and the treatment was to pray for forgiveness, often through the intercession of priests. Doctors in the Middle Ages were usually priests or other religious scholars, and hospitals were located in monasteries. Patients were given food and comforted by regular religious nursing staff, but nothing was done to cure their illness. Traditional cures using herbal remedies and potions were seen as witchcraft, and these were outlawed by the church. Laws stated that only trained and registered people could practice medicine. Surgery was a crude practice during the Middle Ages, but operations did exist for amputations, setting broken bones, replacing dislocations, and binding wounds. Opium was sometimes used as an anesthetic, while wounds were cleaned with wine to try and prevent infections. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, schools and universities began to educate wealthy individuals in religion, the arts, law, and medicine. Selected men from wealthy families were trained to become physicians. As universities developed, more and more physicians came from a non-religious background. It is in this predominantly poor, agrarian, and intensely religious and superstitious civilization that the deadly epidemic of bubonic plague occurred. Plague is a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which circulates among populations of wild rodents, including rats, gerbils, squirrels, and gophers, where the bacteria live and multiply, constituting a plague reservoir. And on this slide, you see a microscopic view of Yersinia pestis. Human plague develops when rodents, usually black rats, in areas inhabited by humans, become infected. The black rat, also known as the house rat or ship rat, likes to live close to people, and it is this proximity that makes it dangerous. A colony of black rats infected with Yersinia pestis will rapidly die off, leaving hungry fleas to find the nearest available new hosts, humans. The fleas are vectors that carry the infectious agent from one group of hosts to the next. Once bitten by an infected flea, a victim experiences sudden symptoms like headache, chills, high fever, nausea, dysphoria, and extreme fatigue within 3 to 5 days. Usually, the bacteria from an infected flea bite drain through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph nodes, generally in the thigh, groin, armpit, or neck. The infected lymph nodes swell dramatically to form painful buboes, which can rupture and drain through the skin. It is these characteristic lesions which provide the name bubonic plague. The plague epidemic is also known as the Black Death, possibly because of the black lesions that infected individuals develop related to necrotic skin. Victims smell terrible, to quote, as if they are rotten. From the lymph nodes, the plague spreads, and internal bleeding can begin with multi-organ failure and necrosis of the extremities. And on this slide, you see above an ancient woodcut showing 2 victims covered with swellings, and below, this is a modern victim of the plague, and you can see he has infected lymph nodes in his neck, which have drained through the skin. Death often follows. There are 2 other forms of plague. Septicemic plague spreads in the bloodstream. It comes from either the flea bites or from contact with plague-infected body tissues. Pneumonic plague is an advanced stage of the disease when it spreads to the lungs and is then passed directly, person to person, through airborne droplets. The pneumonic form is the most virulent. If untreated, more than 90% of pneumonic plague victims die within 24 hours. Overall, 40 to 60% of plague victims in the 14th century died. An Italian of the period wrote, in quotes, "All the healthy citizens did little except carry dead bodies to be buried. At every church, they dug deep pits down to the water table, and those who died during the night were bundled up quickly and thrown into the pit. When a large number of bodies filled the pit, they took earth and shoveled it down on top of them. Later, Other bodies were piled on top, and another layer of earth was added, just as one makes lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese. Excavation and study of these massive burial pits has provided much of our knowledge about the bubonic plague. The plague epidemic spread along trade routes beginning in the autumn of 1346 in Russia, just north of the Caspian Sea. At that time, the area was under the control of the Mongols, who attacked an Italian trading fleet. Plague broke out among the attackers, and when the Italian ships returned home, they carried infected rats and fleas with them. The Italian ships arrived in Constantinople in May of 1347 with the plague on board. As shown in the map, the epidemic spread outward along European trading routes from Constantinople north to the European Mediterranean, inland throughout Italy and south into North Africa and the Middle East. Ultimately, France and Spain were attacked, and as the epidemic spread north, all of the British Isles, beginning in the spring of 1348. By the fall of 1348, Norway and Denmark were involved, and by 1349, the disease had come full circle through Germany and ultimately back into Russia in 1351. Notably, the rise in cases and the spread of disease dramatically slowed in the winter months when flea populations died out and increased again in the spring. Ultimately, the epidemic dwindled and disappeared in Russia in 1353. Only Iceland and Finland avoided the Black Death, probably because they had very limited contact with Europe. Analysis of mortality data estimates that around 60% of Europe's population died during the plague epidemic. Since the size of Europe's population at the time was estimated at 80 million, 50 million people died. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 is still an unparalleled human tragedy. The plague is considered to have been a major source for social change. The dramatic fall in the population of Europe had enormous impact, significantly affecting development from the medieval period into the early modern period. Before the plague, in the early 14th century, much of Europe was suffering with repeated bad crops and famines as the population increased, but the availability of land for crops decreased. The overall health of the population was poor, with starvation and very high infant mortality. The plague was thought to be caused by divine wrath, mediated by, quote, bad air, end quote, by groups of particular sinners like lepers and Jews, or by supernatural forces. From these vague ideas of causality came the limited medieval responses. Prayers and religious ceremonies were all that was available, and they were ubiquitous. One well-described response was the emergence of groups called flagellants, who practiced public self-flagellation and paraded from town to town. Many people began to believe that the plague was caused by some kind of contagion, which spread disease between people. This led to attempts at quarantine, burning the clothes of the sick, and prompt disposal of bodies in mass graves. Still, the disease continued, and death tolls continued to rise. During the height of a local plague epidemic, agricultural, economic, and political activity slowed dramatically, resuming again as the wave of the disease moved on. In the longer term, as described by J.N. Hayes in The Burdens of Disease, our text for this course, the dramatic and sudden decline in population caused by the Black Death shifted the picture of Europe from one of cheap labor and expensive land to a society that was population short, with high labor costs and falling land prices. While there were regional variations in this picture, the lives of average citizens in Western Europe improved after the plague, with abundant and cheap land and high wages. Before the plague, the economy was primarily based on production of grain on small plots of land by a stable population devoting most of its energy to production of food and subsistence goods. After the plague, the demand for grain decreased along with the decrease in population, and land was used for diversified purposes like grazing for sheep, barley for beer, and grapes for wine. The precipitous population decline occasioned by the Black Death compelled Europe to devise labor-saving technologies that transformed the economy. In the century after the Great Epidemic, technological innovation flourished with development of the spinning wheel, water and windmills, and most importantly, the printing press. The scarcity of labor after the plague may well have served as a stimulus for development of these innovations. Many historians consider the plague to have been an important agent of social change. The authority of the landed class and of the church were both weakened, and there was progress in medicine, especially beliefs about disease. The idea of plague as contagious gained ground over a purely religious cause. While the concept that the plague was a visitation from God persisted, measures designed to combat bad air or miasma and to prevent the spread of infection developed with the advent of systems of public health. These were initially appointed groups of citizens tasked with preserving public health and avoiding corruption of the environment, to quote the charge to a Venetian public health committee established after the epidemic. In many cases, these ad hoc committees ultimately morphed into standing public health boards, which were headed by health commissioners and included doctors as members. The boards tried to eliminate sources of corruption of the air by inspecting food and water supplies. They were concerned about sewage and regulated burials and burning of the clothes of the dead. They also recorded the causes of death in their cities. This trend was most pronounced in Italy, where over time the health boards developed a more direct approach to contagion, applying a shift from the miasma theory towards the concept of disease transmission from an infected victim to an uninfected individual. This led to laws governing municipal quarantine and isolation of victims. When a health commission declared the presence of plague in a city, other cities would establish a health corridor around themselves as part of the quarantine. Families of plague victims would be confined to their houses, and objects used by the sick and deceased were burnt. Houses were disinfected using vinegar solution and sulfur paint. In some cities, a pest house was established for victims. These measures were not without consequences beyond any potential public health benefit. They were expensive and led to conflict with the business community because quarantine resulted in a complete cessation of trade and industry. The clergy were distressed because quarantine meant suspension of religious services and processions. Families whose possessions were destroyed in the name of quarantine were angry and resentful. The cost of establishing and staffing isolation houses and for providing care to the sick was expensive and resulted in taxes for the city. As the health bureaucracy grew larger and more intrusive, opposition developed and laws protecting the health commissioners became necessary. Nonetheless, as public health boards amassed information about the plague, the patterns of disease strengthened the concept of the importance of contagion in the spread of disease, beginning in Italy. In England and France, miasma and divine providence remained the dominant theories of disease etiology into the 16th century. However, the English also gradually evolved towards a belief that plague was a disease of the poor and that isolation of plague victims and quarantine of affected communities were important preventive measures. As in Italy, development of health boards to administer these policies often resulted in conflict between anti-plague measures and economic losses. Hygiene and general health began to improve. The plague epidemic and the subsequent progressive belief that plague was contagious definitely contributed to the development of active public health policies across Europe and England. What happened to end the Black Death? After the dramatic and disastrous pandemic of 1346 to 1353, there were still repeated localized outbreaks throughout Europe and in England. These were still very serious, with high mortality, but they were less and less frequent, and by 1721, the plague as an epidemic illness virtually disappeared. What happened? Was it the climate? After 1590, temperatures decreased significantly in Europe, and the time between 1590 and 1850 was known as the Little Ice Age, and we know that fleas do not thrive in a cold climate. Did black rats develop improved immunity? Some historians believe this to be the case. Were there changes in the organism causing the disease? Because mortality in successive outbreaks remained and remains high, we know that the bacteria remained lethal. But were there changes in its ability to initiate infection that led to the disappearance of the plague? Finally, were the public health measures that were instituted effective? Isolation measures may have had some impact, limiting spread of pneumonic plague. So did changes in housing and improved sanitation. However, none of these alone, or even together, is thought to explain the dramatic absence of the plague for almost 200 years. Whatever combination of forces led to the end of plague epidemics in the Middle Ages, the plague had important residual social consequences. It resulted in a major shift in the understanding of disease spread, making the theory of contagion an important concept in disease etiology. And the advent of the measures taken to combat the plague was the expression of a conviction that the actions of humans could affect disease, a new and very important concept. Nutrition, hygiene, and general health began to improve. Thus, the response to the plague established a major role for public health as a critical role in the future of medicine. It was not until the advent of antibiotics that effective specific treatment for plague became available. The World Health Organization recommends that when a diagnosis of plague is suspected, culture should be taken and the patient should be started on specific antimicrobial therapy. Suspect plague patients should be isolated and managed under respiratory droplet precautions. Streptomycin is the drug of choice and is particularly important for the pneumonic form. Gentamicin has also been used. Intensive supportive management of plague complications must be available to address the spread of infection into the bloodstream and therefore throughout the body. Aggressive monitoring and management of possible septic shock, multiple organ failure, adult respiratory distress syndrome, and disseminated bleeding should be instituted. With modern therapy, the fatality rate is still 8 to 10%. Live, attenuated, and formalin-killed Yersinia pestis vaccines are available for human use. The vaccines are variably immunogenic and moderately to highly effective, resulting in development of antibodies. They do not protect against primary pneumonic plague. In general, vaccinating individuals or communities against potential exposure to infected fleas or rats is not feasible. Further, vaccination is of little use during an epidemic since a month or more is required to develop a protective immune response. The vaccine is indicated for persons whose work routinely brings them into contact with Yersinia pestis, such as lab technicians in plague research laboratories and persons studying infected rodent colonies. Plague control also potentially includes addressing rodent and flea populations. For the most part, rodent reservoirs are species that are susceptible to the infection but resistant to the disease. While upwards of 200 species of rodents have been implicated in the cycle of plague in one geographic area or another, the true number of rodent species important as more than accidental reservoirs of plague is uncertain. In general, control of plague transmission from one reservoir to another can be most rapidly affected by control of the flea vector, which should precede any measures against rodent hosts. In areas where plague epidemics have occurred in the past, known endemic foci should be identified and appropriate insecticide susceptibility tested. Information on normal seasonal variations in population density of rodent reservoirs allows detection of any abnormal changes which may precede an epidemic. A natural focus of plague may be dormant for many years, during which time no human cases are reported, but because of changes in the ecology or the human population, the focus may flare up and cases of human plague occur. approach to rodent reservoirs is potentially disadvantageous. Although it might be possible to achieve a high level of rodent control, the death of a large number of plague-infected rodents is likely to simply introduce large numbers of fleas displaced from those hosts. These fleas will avidly seek another host, thus spreading to a greater extent than would have been likely had the rodent host not been killed. Thus, the first step in controlling an outbreak is control of the vector flea. Once the flea population has been reduced, control of rodent reservoirs can be undertaken. The plague today. While the bubonic plague that terrorized Europe and Asia in the 6th and 14th centuries is almost extinct, a few countries, most of them in Africa and Asia, have reported cases in the last decade. These include Zambia, India, Malawi, Algeria, Madagascar, China, and Peru. Since 2001, the Democratic Republic of the Congo tops the list with more than 1,100 cases, according to the World Health Organization. Between 1,000 and 2,000 cases are reported each year, though the true number is most likely higher. It's hard to assess the mortality rate in developing countries, as few cases are reliably diagnosed and reported to health authorities. The WHO cites mortality rates of 8 to 10%, similar to what we know, but studies suggest that they may be much higher in some plague endemic areas. In January of 2015, the head of the World Health Organization warned about an alarming plague outbreak in Madagascar that could rapidly worsen as fleas that transmit the disease to humans have developed immunity to the insecticide used. Margaret Chan reviewed the ongoing threat from emerging and epidemic-prone diseases, including the plague outbreak that began last November, but has been receiving little public attention despite its disturbing dimensions. Plague is considered to be endemic in Madagascar, where seasonal outbreaks have been exacerbated by poverty and an increasing number of people living in close urban settings. A recent tropical storm increased the threat of the disease, spreading from untold numbers of rats that were displaced by flooding. The current outbreak has established a foothold in the capital city and could spread easily through the city's densely populated slums. Chan reported, "This is alarming, as around 8% of plague cases progress to the lethal pneumonic form, which is spread directly from person to person." While bubonic plague had largely disappeared from Madagascar between 1930 and 1990, approximately 200 cases have been reported each year since then, and the disease takes on epidemic form annually. At the start of each rainy season, rats flee Madagascar sewers in massive numbers and take refuge in the cottages of the population. The agency's report emphasizes that a flea-killing approach must be part of the approach, or the fleas will merely seek alternate hosts, and that is humans. Since September of 2014, 263 cases, including 71 deaths, have been reported, representing a case fatality rate of 27%. The Central Highlands District has been the most heavily affected, with cases of pneumonic plague continuing to be reported during the first week of January of this year. Treatment with appropriate antibiotics is effective, as we know, but their efficacy depends on early detection. When this is the case fatality rate can be reduced, and this is especially important for the pneumonic form. A robust and sensitive diagnostic test, developed at the country's own Institut Pasteur and subsequently introduced elsewhere in Africa and in South America, with World Health Organization support, produces reliable results in 15 minutes, and this greatly facilitates containment efforts. However, control of plague outbreaks in Madagascar has been complicated by development of resistance to the first-line insecticide in the fleas that transmit the disease. Over the past 3 years, the annual number of cases has steadily increased, making Madagascar the country most severely affected by plague worldwide. On February 4th, 2015, the African Development Bank announced a grant of $1 million to support the containment of plague in Madagascar. The grant will be managed by the World Health Organization and is being used to upgrade isolation and laboratory facilities and to purchase antibiotics, insecticides, diagnostic kits, and equipment. In the United States, cases of bubonic plague are extremely rare, but in November of 2002, a couple from Santa Fe were diagnosed with the plague. They both experienced flea bites in New Mexico, but the couple then flew to New York City for a planned vacation. They began feeling sick in their hotel with what they thought was a typical flu bug, but then the wife developed an unusual and painful swelling in her groin. While they were waiting to be seen in the emergency room, her husband became increasingly ill and ultimately was admitted in shock. The diagnosis of plague was made immediately based on the wife's classic bubo. The husband, who was critically ill, had no characteristic lesion. He rapidly developed multiple organ failure and was unresponsive on a ventilator for almost 3 months. During that time, he developed progressive gangrene of the lower extremities and required amputation of both legs. His survival is attributed to the rapid diagnosis, which allowed appropriate aggressive antibiotics and supportive care. So, while nothing like the dramatic pandemic of the 14th century has occurred, the plague is alive and well as a lethal disease, just waiting for the right combination of opportunities to emerge. Concerns that the plague could fuel bioterrorist activities remain valid in our time. Now, an update to the plague story occurred in March of 2013 when engineers extending the London Underground system uncovered 25 skeletons in a 5.5-meter wide shaft alongside pottery dated to the mid-14th century. To pinpoint which historical plague outbreak the Charterhouse 25 could have fallen victim to, the researchers used radiocarbon dating. They determined the burial ground was used within the time period of the Black Death in 1348 to 1350. British forensic scientists and archaeologists examined the skeletons and compared human DNA from their teeth with samples from the recent outbreaks in Madagascar. The samples were an almost perfect match, suggesting that the medieval plague was the same virulent form as the contemporary strain. And on this slide you can just see archaeologists with this burial site, and you can see the outlines of the skeletons. This is from London in 2013. The skeletons provided a rare opportunity to study the medieval population of London. Analysis of their bones and teeth indicated that many appeared to suffer signs of anemia, malnutrition, and rickets. There was also a high rate of back damage and strain, indicating heavy manual labor. One of the researchers commented, "The combination of a poor diet and generally a life struggle means these individuals were very susceptible to the plague at that time, and that's possibly one of the explanations for why the Black Death was so devastating." These findings confirm Yersinia pestis as the causative agent of the Black Death. Improved nutrition and health of the general population may well have contributed to end the plague epidemic.